Good morning. We're in Ayin Beis, reviewing its conclusion, last 100 to 130 pages. And we are on page 1379. What we learned yesterday was more details about the birur, the clarification, the clarity that the Torah empowers us with in all areas of life. He called it pnimi, area of achila, what we consume, what we digest, what we take into our lives. Makif, levushim, what we wear, our garments. And finally, bayis, where we dwell, the homes in which we live. And as I explained, these are the three main main three categories of human functionality and healthy living. And in all those areas, we have the birur of Torah Sheba'al Peh, namely Mishnah, that draws the clarity from the Chochma law of Torah Shebiksav, where things are more brief and concise. As he said, to bring it down, Gzaru Psak Din Lamaisa, and that's why it's called Masnisa Malkusa, referring to Mishnah as a queen, kingship like a leader. But Mishnah takes it further, like the Sari HaMelucha, like the ministers that carry the message, that carry the decrees and the guidelines of the leader, of the king, to the people. It's galus like the Sari HaMelucha. So that's why Talmud Chacham are called Sarim. Like Rabbi Yechim Bezaki said, Ani Kesar, they're called like ministers. Limudi Havaya, they're the teachers. Limudi Havaya, they receive from Shem Havaya, which in this is Torah Shebiksav, and through them they define and they shape every Dvar Malchus L'Maisa B'Poel Mamish. So we have Mikra and Mishnah in the context of what we've been discussing, of bringing clarity. So though the general ideas were discussed earlier, but as we've been learning, he's now gone to deeper explanation, understanding it in the context of Chochma and Bina, which will now go into more detail as he moves to Talmud. Because this explains to us what happened till the time of Rabbeinu HaKodesh, who was the compiler of the Mishnah, where he received ish mipi ish, in an unbroken chain, where they had the clarity just as it was in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, if it's just like it was, but definitely that chain, that line of that connection to the source code was there. So now the question is, what happens next? So the next section is going to be associated very much with pages 1372 and 1373 and 1374. 1372 through 1374, where he already explained the difference between Mishnah and Talmud. And briefly, what we learned was that Mishnah is ish mipi ish. It's a gilui that comes generation to generation. And what they basically did was clarify what they received from their teachers, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, Mepi Agvura from Har Sinai, and they clarified it, and that was defined what the Mishnah was. Talmud is already the effort of the students to try to understand what their teachers, the Tanoim and the Mishnah, were saying, due to the fact that the Mishnah is also brief, relatively, and the Mishnah, like he said, Dvarim Stumim, and there are things that are not defined in halacha, and they're contradictory Mishnahs. So that's what the next generation did through there, what he called koyach sichlam, koyach chachmasam. So we're not talking about Chochma law informing Chochma Tata, which is what Mishnah is about. Now we're talking about the effort that comes, so to speak, from the bottom up. It's still based on the rules and the guidelines of Torah, obviously. They didn't just come and innovate ideas. But nevertheless, here the effort is much more, and much more weight is carried over, placed upon the efforts of these students, or the Amirayim, we'll call them, the Chachmei Talmud, as we're going to learn now in more detail. So that we've learned, and so whatever we're learning is, I'm just referring to those pages back because they're very much connected, and the Rebbe Rashab is relying on what he said already, but he's not going to put it into the context that we've been learning here about Chochma and Bina, Birur, the context of what is Birur exactly, the clarification of bringing the clarity of Chochma law into into the world of, through Bina, into a world where there is no clarity and finding that clarity. So that's what we're going to learn. The new paragraph on page 1379, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. And so let's read inside. Now, however, all this is Mishnah. B'Gemara, he taimei ha-Mishnah. Earlier, he said the words, the Pirush Shabir ha-Mishnah. This is obviously all complementing each other, so it's the same idea. The Gemara is the reasons of the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't always give reasons. V'hashakal v'tarya b'chol inyoni ha-Mishnah. And a discussion and dialogue, and back and forth, even debate, in all the inyanim of the Mishnah. Like you see, whenever you learn Gemara, what's the first thing that happens? You finish the Mishnah, the Gemara then quotes the first few words of the Mishnah and begins to elaborate. What does it mean? And then when it finishes analyzing one piece of the Mishnah, the Gemara continues. Usually there's a like a colon that separates, and we're now going to analyze the next piece of the Mishnah. So that's what he's calling Taimi HaMishnah and Shaka V'Tarya B'chol Inyone HaMishnah. As I said earlier, he used the word Pirush Shabir HaMishnah. U'b'chol Dini HaTeira Al Pi HaTam V'Haseichel B'Sforos HaMukis U'B'Pilpul Otzim. So this is a discussion and debate and a conversation in Kol Inyone HaMishnah and all the Dini HaTeira, which of course the Mishnah covers as it formulates the halachas based on the psukim in the written Torah. And what does it do? It does al pitam v'seichel. This is already now not purely what they received. Now let's make this clear. The Tanoim also used tam v'seichel. We learned that earlier. They even have their own svaros we spoke about. However, their svaros were informed by and illuminated by the Chochma Ilaah passed on from generation to generation. So Talmud, the focus is a lot more on the tam v'seichel, on the reason and the seichel and the logic. B'sforos hamukes, profound arguments or profound theories. Ubepilpul otzim, and an intense debate or intense discussion. Lahitzi, in order to draw out din amiti, betuma v'tara v'isa v'heter. The clear and true law, halacha, in the laws of Tuma and Tara, that's using those examples, impurity and purity, the laws of Tuma and Tara, and the laws of Isser and Heter, of what is allowed, what is prohibited, and what is allowed. That's the Rosh Tevis. He used it earlier too, at the end of the paragraph in the last page. This is what Gemara does. So the Gemara is continuing the discussion of the Mishnah, obviously, but it's in far more analysis and far more depth. And as we'll soon learn, this is going to be the ultimate bina. Remember, Chochma bina. We'll soon get to that. V'hi hasogas ha'emes lo kamei ha'mishnah. This is hasogas ha'emes. This is an appreciation of comprehending and understanding the truth. Not like the Mishnah shehiriyas ha'emes be'ayin ha'seichel. Not like the Mishnah where there's a clarity that those teachers had. But riyas ayin ha'seichel, they were able to visualize with the eye of the mind. Yes, it wasn't a physical vision, but it's the intellectual clarity. And as we said earlier on the top of the previous page, he said that's from midas shebachachma, the midas of Chochma Ilaah as it manifests in Chochma Tata in Malchus. That's the clarity they had. That's Mishnah, Kanal, as we learned earlier. So it is not just pure Chochma Ilaah, it is midas that is revealing the inner meaning of the written Torah, but it's a clarity that's coming from above. And that's why in the Mishnah it all comes, b'dvarim k'tsarim, it comes in very in brief, obviously not as brief as the written Torah, but still relatively brief. And it's aligned exactly according to the truth of Eirach Chochma, because that's what Mishnah has, that power of that clarity. So think about master teachers who have that connection, as I mentioned, straight to the source code and that clarity, like Moshe Rabbeinu and the others that he said, they had the clarity straight as it was from the source. That's Mishnah. So by contrast, we'll get back to Talmud shortly. By contrast, Talmud is Hasogas HaEmes. This is already the students trying to understand. They don't have that clarity. They had that clarity, they wouldn't need the Gemara. They would be like the Balei Mishnah. So here you're talking about the next generation of students who don't have that type of visual clarity. So they do it through pilpul, otzum, like he said, and svaras hamukes, through discussion and through discovery and through analysis and evaluation and arguments and disagreements to try to get many questions to get to that deeper clarity that you get through in Gemara. But he's still speaking, so far, he's still speaking about Mishnah. He went back to Mishnah to contrast that with Talmud. So now he's going to bring another text from the Mittler Rebbe, which is a mimer from the Alter Rebbe that actually states in straight language. This is going to be an actual citation. He's going to quote a direct citation from a mimer. The mimer is printed in Memoria Admor Zakon. It's called his Halach Lozhnia. It means the journey through Lozhnia that the Alter Rebbe, when he traveled, and he was then still in Lozhnia, was before he came to Liadi, he was in Lozhin. So on page 3, so he's now going to quote that exact language. So, but before I go there, if anybody wants to ask anything, let me stop for a moment before the next section. Okay. The Isa B'Ksavim. And we find it says in the writings, the manuscripts. It's not a common language you find in the Maimarim because there's a lot of things the Rebbe Rashab brings from writings and manuscripts. Sometimes he writes Ksavim, sometimes he doesn't. Earlier, if I recall correctly, when he began to speak about Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, just want to see one thing. 1 second, please. He also said Isa B'Ksavim, interestingly. The second line on page 1364, the bottom paragraph. That's the Maimer Ve'inenu Me'iris. But he also used the word Isa B'Ksavim. So Ksavim generally means it's still a manuscript, it wasn't published. Now it is published. As I just told you, it's page 3 in the Salach Lozhny. So B'Ksavim, and here it goes further, which is even more rare. He says whose writings? He says B'Ksaviyat Kodesh, in the holy manuscript, the holy handwriting of Admur Amtsoy Nishmos Eidin Zechrein Sadiv Kodesh L'Varacha, in the writings of the Mittler Rebbe. So this is actually from his original manuscript of the Mittler Rebbe, a mimer of the Alter Rebbe that the Mittler Rebbe had heard and wrote down. B'zeh haloshen. And this is the exact language that's written in the manuscript. Rabbeinu HaKodesh, who's talking about Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi, of course, the compiler of the Mishnah, Ha'yedei Gilei Elakus. He knew and perceived divine revelation, Dvar Hashem Mamish. Mamish, the word of God, Shebemidesav Yizbarach, Shenimshechu Mechachmei Ilaah. So it's actually confirming what he said earlier on the top of page 1378. Why he didn't bring this Ksavim there, that I'm not sure. But it doesn't matter. It's still connected to all of it. So it says clearly, he knew Dvar Hashem Mamish, which was in the Midas, in the God's divine attributes, that Nimshachu Mechachmei Ilaah, that transmitted and drawn from Chochma Ilaah. You look on the top of the previous page, 1378, he says that Mashanimshach Mechachmei Ilaah, the Chochma Tatar Teshbeh, whom Mebchinas Hamidah Shebechachma. So here you have the exact source. That's what Rabbeinu HaKadosh knew. L'chein ha'yedea, this is all the language of this manuscript. And that's why he perceived, he was aware, he knew, l'sadram b'dvorim shebeloshen zeh dafke. That's why he knew how to organize, and when he wrote it down in writing, to organize it specifically in this language. Because, like any writing, when you hear something that you heard Baal Peh orally, and I can testify to this as a chayzer, there's many, you write down, but different writers may use different words. What I mean by that you don't write different ideas, but expressions are different words. There's different words that you can use to explain something. But he knew exactly how to be Mesav b'dvarim shebeloshen zeh dafke. Because he was aligned and had that direct link to where he received it. So he had that clarity exactly how to organize. B'dvarim shebeloshen zeh dafke. Well, maybe let me read the niggin a little different. Nishmas pleni kishemedaber b'yira gdela merkava lemidas diyitzira. So it's an interesting expression. He's saying, Dafka in this lashon, nishmas pleni, that when a person, in the shama of an individual who's learning this, kishemedaber b'yira gdela, when he speaks with great reverence, he'll align himself merkava lemidas diyitzira. He'll be like a chariot to the midas of Yitzira. So here we see again that Mishnah is connected to Yitzira. Remember, it originates in Chagas of Atzilus, the midas that are drawn from Chochma of Atzilus. That's where Mishnah comes from. But it manifests in the midas of Yitzira. But Rabbeinu HaKadosh, but it's completely aligned to the way it is in Chochma, and that's why Dafka this lashon will align the person to be a vehicle for the midas of Yitzira. Kamoi im yemer. This neshama, when he learns the Torah, if he'll say me'emes ha'keirus hashma ba'arvis, the first Mishnah, he's giving an example. Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote these words. From when do you read Shema? When do you begin reading? When are you allowed to begin reading Shema? In the evening. Mishosh ha'keinim nechnosim, as the Mishnah says, from the time that the Chayim Mechnosim in order to eat Truma, which means at the end of the day, when they had their designated time, that's when you say Kra. This language, this exact language is the way Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote it down. Why this language? Why Mishosh HaKayanim? He could have said a different language. He could have said from sunset, or when the stars start emerging, like he's going to say. If he does not say the siman, how do you know when? The time when the Kohanim enter to eat Truma, but instead, the Mishnah would say, we would learn the Mishnah would say, from the time, for example, when the stars emerge. That's also a siman. It would not be quite aligned like a vehicle for being a container, a channel for the Dvar Hashem Zu Ha'oris Midesiv Yizbarach Shebetei Shabbat Peh. For this Bar Hashem, that's because remember the whole thing is coming from the Torah to know when Hashem wants us to say Shema. So if it was not said in this particular language, it would not be quite the keli to be a vehicle for Dvar Hashem. That manifests within the oral Torah. Ad kan l'shene. So he quoted exactly word for word from the manuscript. So this is a direct quote that explains what is the clarity that Rabbeinu HaKadosh in the Mishnah had. Now, however, we don't know, for example, what's the difference? What's the difference had he said from the time when the stars emerge? At the end of the day, it's two simanim for the same thing. It's like saying two things are happening at a time. Instead of saying when the stars start emerging, he says when the Kohanim go into Truma. Why is that so negayah? That is not clear in the Mishnah. But we do know that what Rabbeinu HaKadosh said is the way it should be said. That is exactly, it's important to know that. And the Gemara Taka analyzes that as he's going to explain. The Gemara is now going to say, why does he say that? Why doesn't he say Tzeis HaKachavim? And we derive many lessons from that. So he's going to explain now how the Mishnah has a clarity that Rabbeinu HaKadosh had that the next generation needs to analyze and explain because we wouldn't know it on our own. Because the Mishnah does not tell us why he used that siman and not a different siman. So he's using this to explain now how Mishnah and Talmud work hand in hand. So let's continue reading and you'll see how this develops. B'dugma, after quoting the manuscript, he says, now this is like an example. So even though the Mishnah is not quite the precision of the written Torah, obviously a Sefer Torah is far more precise, but still, relatively speaking, the language of Rabbeinu HaKodesh has a certain quality of precision as well. Like bedugme, like Teresh said, there has to be dafka in these letters. Why did it say Bereshis bara Elokim? It could have said it in different ways. Could have said Elokim bara Bereshis, or other terms. We know it's exactly precise the way it's stated. So he's saying the Mishnah has a certain element that's similar to that. That since Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbeinu HaKodesh, was so linked in and connected, so since, like he said, Yedeya, Gilei Elokus Dvar Hashem Mamish B'Midesov, he knew what words to use. So the words he uses are precise, similar to the precision of the written Torah. It's only similar. It's not quite the same, but again, relatively speaking. Because it's these words, dafka these words, not other words, that are the proper kalim, the proper channels, or the proper containers to express the idea that needs to be expressed. And you see this when we listen to a master teacher. As an example, I'm giving an example. Someone who really is really very seasoned and thorough and a lot of experience. If they express something a certain way, it's not just the idea that they're conveying that's important. It could also be medayik. You could analyze, why did they say it this way and not that way? It's not always the case, obviously, because you can have people who can say the same idea different ways. But when you talk about this level, there's a precision even of how it's expressed. What words are used, what examples are used, what simonim, what signs are used. So this is part of the Chochma as well. But this is shayach, this is possible for people who have that type of clarity, that they express a dafka this way. That's why, for example, when we learn Tanya, we could sit for hours and analyze why the Alter Rebbe he added a vav and didn't add a vav. He said that on a vav he once sat 20 years just on whether to add that vav or not. This is the precision that comes when you have this type of clarity. So it's the kelim hashayachim ela'er v'hein b'chinas esis dema de chochma. In Kabbalistic terminology, is the letters of ma. Chochma is koyach ma. Ma is bittul. Ma is completely. It's not about the recipient. It's about the oir. It's completely aligned to ma de chochma shakeli lefi erech ha'er. On that level of ma of chochma, the keli is commensurate to the oir. So you have exactly the right words, the right letters and words to use to express this idea. Commission is barely ill, as was explained earlier, immediately and earlier as well, earlier in the Hemshech. Similarly, Mishnah bedugma kazes says clearly bedugma, meaning it's not exactly, it's an example. Hagam shezeo teresh shabal, even though the Mishnah is not the written Torah, so therefore it doesn't have quite that type of accurate precision. Nevertheless, it still has to be expressed with these words and not other words. Because either the words that have that gili, that reveal the level of chochma that the Mishnah is conveying. Now he's going to explain, actually, this Gemara that talks about the Mishnah Me'emes Hakeres Hashma in this context. But let me stop a moment before we go there, if anybody wants me to clarify anything. So now to go back to this.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So far be it for me to, question a tzaddik, God forbid, who's giving over this Chassidus and explaining why the words are what they are in the Mishnah. It sounds like he's saying it's that way because it has to be that way. In other words, you're just saying, well, if that's the way he said it, it has to be that way because those words are the keli for the elokus, the transmission that's intended to be given, which is not. I mean, obviously you can't argue with that, but it's a little syllogistic. I'm just saying doesn't really explain it. He just says that's what he said. So those must be the letter, the oisios, the words, the lashon that carries that or that light. I don't
Well,
know.
look,
It just seems syllogistic.
To me, the opposite is very, very logical, based on simple fact. If I met two people and both are conveying an idea that the Rebbe said 40 years ago, let's say, one of them actually heard it from the Rebbe. He was there. The other one heard it from others. So, of course, I'd be much more medaic in the first person because he heard it directly, and I would say, tell me exactly the way you heard it. Whereas the second person was already a second bounce. Rabbeinu HaKodesh, like we've been learning at length here, and his colleagues and those before them had this clarity literally because they all lived, one of the physical explanations is because they were all in the same area, but they were also on a spiritual higher level. So therefore, the words exactly as Hashem said it to Moshe, and Moshe passed it on to Yeshua, and Yeshua to the Skenim, as we learned. He said clearly, Ish mi pi ish, and he actually used these words. I'll read it inside. Very strong and powerful words. He said like this, on page 1367, that it was exactly, he says, I'm sorry, 13, let's see here, 1360, no, my mistake. I think 1373. He says like this, שנמסר בעל פה, בדברור וצול כל דין והלכה כמשהו בלי נצטרך לזה עיון ופלפל כלל, בבירור גורם בלי שום בלבול, exactly as it passed on. So if I can meet someone who actually is like an eyewitness, or more than that, who heard exactly the words as it was passed on, that tells me this is a person who, and that's why Rabbeinu HaKadosh actually wrote it down, because he saw that, and his colleagues saw that they were being forgotten. So the mission is actually the words as they heard it from their teachers, as accurately as they were able to convey it. Whereas somebody else who Baal Peh could say, okay, maybe he got the idea right, but it's not precisely the right way. So you want to also know not just the idea, but how is it communicated? So yes, now you could sit down and, as we'll learn now, the next generation analyzes why Taka did he use those words? Why not another way of expressing it? But this is essentially what he's stating, that till Rabbeinu HaKadosh, they had that clarity. So not just the ideas were conveyed, but the words they used had that form of accuracy and precision.
I see.
That's
Thank
how
you.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So now he says like this, V'yadua, the second line from the bottom of the page, the Masha'amar Mishash HaKeinim Nichnosim, when it says in the Mishnah that when can you begin to read Shema in the evening? From the time that the Kahanim enter, they had a designated time. So he says, Merumas B'zeh, it's known that this indicates the Bia Shamshe Makvose Belechel Betruma, the Enka Parose Makvese. So the Gemara explains why did he use this siman? Because he wants to explain that when Kohanim who are Tomei are not allowed to eat Truma, but the Truma ends at the end of the day. The question is, when does it end? When the sun sets, or does it end when they go to the mikveh and they're kapara? In other words, is it based on an action or based on the actual time? So, but by saying that Shema is said in the evening, when the Kohanim enter, he's telling us that's not dependent on kapara, it's dependent on the sunset. In the Gemara, there's a discussion on this. And the Gemara concludes and proves this. Next page. It explains this with a seichel and tam. So Rabbeinu HaKadosh just made the statement. And now, as they analyze it and they discuss it, they come away with a conclusion. Why is that? So that teaches us halacha. The Mishnah doesn't say this halacha. The Mishnah just says the siman. When do you start saying Shema? When the Kohanim enter to be able to eat Truma. But from the Gemara, in its discussions and arguments, comes away with the conclusion that from this we know that it's the sun set. In other words, at the time that determines this, not the pure kapara. So in other words, for example, if for whatever reason the Kohanim would have the kapara earlier, that would not be enough. You need the sun to actually set. You need the time, the clock basically, to be that way. Ubetanoim, that's the Amoraim who discusses in the Gemara. But Tanoim Heir Eira Emes Shukain, the Tanoim did not need this analysis. They had that clarity at the outset. And they didn't need any reason for it. That's how they were makabel. They were makabel, that's the way it is. But the next generation takes their words and analyzes it to come away with this clarity. Valderech. He gives an example for this. Let's see the example. So it says, the Gemara says, Lashon is Rav and Shmuel are another classic colleagues that had disagreements about quite a few matters. So it says Rav prohibited something. That comes beside the Midrash Shebechachma, like he said, from the clarity of the Midrash Shebechachma, K'meish Kosem Mokamacher, the Isa b'Mokamacher, the Ad Rav Shmuel Hayagili Eira Chachma. So that Rav and Shmuel also had this Gili Eira Chachma. That's why Rav answered something. Even though you ask the question, if you ask him the question why, so it just says he answered it. He had his reasons, but you trusted his clarity. The point he's saying is there are those that come with a reasoning and explanation, and those that we trust because they have that clarity. That doesn't mean there isn't a reason, but the later generations go ahead and analyze it to explain the reasons behind it. And here's the key thing. But when that clarity of Chochma gets concealed, so then there's no other way. The only way to arrive at clarity and what is true, what is the right conclusion, is through tam. The only way is to evaluate it, is to discuss it and explain it till you get to the bottom of it. So in other words, there's situations where people have a certain clarity, like we learned earlier about Chochma. The clarity is there. The problem is when there isn't the clarity, that's when you need Bina, using the language that he used earlier, he's going to use it soon, to try to figure out, and that's why you need the whole discovery, because that clarity of Chochma is not shining necessarily. And that's where the next generation comes in to find it through Tam v'Seichel. And so is it, just like this examples we just gave, who to draw out and derive all the details of the halachas in the Mishnah, and to understand the laws of the Mishnah, and in what manner mishtoi does it apply? It's all al pi seichel b'yagir rabba, with extreme exertion. In other words, it doesn't come easy. This is Yagir Rabbi is calling it. So it's one thing when you receive a clarity, fine. It's another when you don't have that clarity, and then you have to struggle, and you need to go into a profound, in-depth analysis and in-depth comprehension to get to arrive at that clarity. And part of the process, like we learned earlier, is like after number of questions and contradictions, you come to this conclusion. The example used that the Gemara will say, okay, well, seemingly there's a contradiction, so the Gemara will analyze it until they come away. In this situation, and we're talking about this. And that situation is talking about a different circumstance. That doesn't come easily. That comes after an analysis where you could say, the reason that you find this contradiction is because this one is talking about certain circumstances and the other one's talking about other circumstances. Like I gave the example from Bab Mitzvah. You find something in the street, and in one place it says you have to return it to the owner. The other place it says it belongs to you. It seems like a contradiction. And the Gemara will explain, because it has a siman. If it has a sign, let's say the name of the owner on it, so by someone that has the name on it. I'm just giving a very simplistic example. And the other case is talking where there is no name or there is no sign. And the Gemara analyzes what that means. What's a sign? What's considered a sign? What's not considered? In other words, an indicator that who it belongs to. The point is that this is a process that requires a cognitive, intense analysis to determine and distinguish. I mean, anyone that is in the world of law, you don't have to be in the world of law, but especially if you're an attorney, you know this. You know, when you try to compare precedents, different cases, so in some cases you look for the commonality, and sometimes you say, yes, in that case, it was that way because this A, B, C, D, E. This case, however, has different circumstances. So even though there's some things in common and similar, but there's differences, and therefore the conclusion should be a different conclusion. So this is a process that's al pitam v'seichel. This is not a process that is being. We didn't hear this from the teacher, from the master, that says this is how it is. This is due to the kashen nesalim era chochma. Shebezeh yedin amitis hakavona. Through this process of questions and contradictions and analysis and discussion, from this you come to amitis hakavona, the true intention, shebe Mishna, in the Mishnah, v'amitis hadin shebe'ofen kach v'kach dafke. And the true din, what is the ruling? The true ruling that is dafke be'ofen kach v'kach ve'ein bezeh stira me Mishnah acheres shemishtoy be'ofen acher. And there's not a contradiction to another Mishnah where there is discussing it in the context of it, in a different context, different circumstances. So essentially, we've already learned this piece actually earlier, but he's again summing it up in the context of everything we've been learning now. So we have here that through this process, of one hand, questions, contradictions, a struggle, you come to a deeper clarity. The Gam, if you recall what he said, there were three things that we achieved through Bina, through this clarity. One is that you come to everybody recognizes the truth of it. Two, that it's mukhrach. It's absolutely this way and not another way. And three, the third thing, v'gam ribu yakushis ulahasid asigim v'apselis. There are many questions and analysis that we went through to get to this conclusion, removes all the waste and all the pselis, the sigim, the sediment and the waste, sheyachalias machmas heder gili era emes, the chochma Ilaah, that's capable of being there due to the lack of the revelation of the emes of Chochma. So we know we said you can come to mistakes, or worse, even a sheker, things that are false, different falsehoods. To mishum ze yochel lipul betaz v'sheker. Without this clarity, without asking all these questions and clarifying the points, you can come to that you can fall into mistakes, v'sheker, and falsehoods, ubahapilpul. And through this elaborate deliberation. Also a good word here. Boim kol ha'inyonim eich shehen. And through the pilpul, you come from all the subjects you're talking about. Shaloi kafia emes or boim al eira emes. You're coming from a place where they could have possibly been not correct, and from there you're arriving to eira emes. So from darkness, you're illuminating through this process of this deliberation of pilpul to find the emes. So all the things that are not kafi emes come to clarity of eira emes. The kol zehu b'yigir rabba, and all this, he repeats again, is with tremendous exertion, or b'koyach atzmo, and with their own initiative, with their own power. It's not what they heard from their teachers. If they heard it from their teachers, they wouldn't need to go through this process. B'koyach atzmon, haynu b'koyach sichlom v'diyosam. What means koyach atzmon? The power of their intelligence and their perception. V'gam b'mesiras nefesh ala teira, which he mentioned earlier as well. Their mesiras nefesh. He said this on top of page 1376. Their commitment and their dedication. So in other words, not just because they're brilliant, but also because they really care. The type of absolute devotion, mesiras nefesh, ala Teda over Teda, because they really want to cut to the bottom of what Teda wants of us. So it wasn't some type of abstract or theoretical exercise, but it's it very much affects them and touches them in the deepest place, in their nefesh. Leida amitis atera. Negei benefesh, basically. They must get to the bottom of what to know. What is the truth of Torah? So this process of koyach asman, their seichel and yediyah, coupled with mesiras nefesh, through that kivnu ela emes. So they did a line. They had the basically, this gave them the power to actually arrive and accurately arrive at the truth. The min hashamayim yisayehu, because from heaven they were helped. So in other words, even though it's their effort, but their effort with the mesiras nefesh, so then they received the blessings from above to help them. If you remember, this lashon was used earlier by the Tanoim as well. That the Tanoim also had the siyum min hashamayim. He used that expression earlier where he spoke. I think it was at the bottom of, I recall, the bottom of 1373, maybe. Yeah, 1373, closer to the bottom. He said, "Min hashamayim yisayu lechaven kol advorim." There he was talking about Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Now he's saying the same as here. And it's not a contradiction, obviously, because either way you need God's help. So even Moshe Rabbeinu, who had the clearest reception, of course, because he received it directly from Hashem and Sinai, he also, by being his bittul and so on, gave him that siyua. The question is, how much of it is coming from above and how much is coming through our effort? So every effort everyone has to have some effort. Question is, what extent? Here, obviously, the effort is stronger because there's more concealment. But at the same time, that doesn't mean the effort is not blessed with help from above. So that's always going to be the case in context of mamat l'mayla, mayla lamata, the interface, that even when you're doing a mamat l'mayla, there's always going to be, you want to have Hashem's blessings in the efforts that you make. The question is how much of your effort is necessary, and that depends on how much concealment there is. If there's more concealment, you're going to need to work harder. If there's less concealment, it'll come easier. So just to explain how this works. The mishum zeh, additionally, so it's not just shamayim yisayeu, he says that they help, but also because they had mesiras nefesh, so digdeku biyeser. So because they had that commitment, they were even more precise in their analysis. So the digdeku biyeser, when someone really cares, they look at every letter and they pore over it and analyze it. If someone's doing it more in a perfunctory or more in a more cursory way, then they won't necessarily be medagdig biyeser. Ube'iyun ve'ema gadol, and with great in-depth iyun, in depth, and iyun and emek. I'm trying to find the different words translate iyun and emek. They're very similar. Iyun means to immerse yourself. Emek is depth. Gadol ad shebo el era emes. So when someone really cares about something, they're going to be far more precise. So he's saying here that in addition to the shamayim seyu, the fact that they also cared so much, received a blessing from above, but also caused them to be much more accurate in finding the emes. Like it says elsewhere, and it says where, this is Samach Vov. But Drush Yom Tov Shalosh Hashanah, Reish Samach Vov. That's where he discusses that when a person really is medagdik and looking for the halacha, and it's like Moshe Nefesh, they will find more clarity than someone that's looking at it more in a called superficial way. Okay. I'm going to stop here probably, but the next section is going to say that the paradox is here that this powerful clarity they arrive at came, ironically, not through revelation, it came through darkness. So we still have to get back to the point that we had learned earlier, that in an interesting way, this process, even though it's coming from the bottom up relatively, is going to achieve a clarity that's even greater than the clarity of the Mishnah that comes from the top down. Going to learn about that next in the next pages. But first, he's going to discuss how it comes dafka through cheshach. And this already was also a point we learned earlier. We learned earlier that it's dafka the cheshach, the challenges that arrive that bring us to this type of clarity. But I think we should stop here because the next section is going to go into that more detail. But again, I compare these pages, the 1372 through 1374, where we discussed this already earlier. But let me stop now. If anybody, we'll stop here learning and tell me if you have any questions, please. Yeah.
Rabbi, I haven't been following every class, but I thought the Mishnah was from the bottom up also, no? Or
everything is relative.
Talmud?
Everything is relative. Okay. The Mishnah, he said, was passed on generation to generation, and then they documented. And it was not based on their logical process. There's some ideas that they initiated, like we learned from the Rambam, but it's primarily what they heard from their teachers that their teachers heard from their teachers. So compared to Mikra, there's more Mamata Lamaila in Mishnah. But as I explained a number of times, especially in my introductions, everything has Mamata Lamaila Mamaila. Moshe Rabbeinu also was Mamata Lamaila. He had to climb the mountain to hear even the written Torah. Everything is an element of us making an effort and reading it, or learning it, or receiving it. The question is how much of Mamata Lamaila and how much Mamaila Lamata. So in the process of an interface of Torah interacting with the world, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are like three stages of how much the Torah is integrated. Is it on God's terms? Is it on our terms? Or the combination of both? So Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are like three steps in the process. Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, or Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. That's the general picture of it.
Thank you. There's always a tendency to want to see things in black and white terms. So that's very helpful.
Nothing is ever going to be black and white in Chassidus, because you're not talking about physical items, you know. And the truth is, if you learn some physics, even the physical world is not black and white. It looks like it is, but when you get into the subatomic structures of things, there's a far more amorphous lines than very deterministic ones.
Totally. Thank you.
I have a question, if possible. If not, you know, then you'll tell me. We'll push it off later. But you know, we're doing this review to try to see how the Alter Rebbe and Mitler Rebbe Maimer and Mikashem Elokeinu Hamagbi L'Sheves. So which analyze primarily these two psukim that Ner Hashem Nismos out of Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Or. So in the first of those two psukim regarding what is a lamp or a candle, so we learned that the neshama essentially harnesses the nefesh hasichlis, or the Stichlis Enoshi, that the human intellect, that the divine soul harnesses the animal intellect and to basically transform it into a keli for Elikus. So, but that's the first pasuk, that the neshama is really doing that. But at the same time, the second pasuk comes to talk about what's the rule, what's the function of Torah. But here in this what we're learning now about Gemara particularly is the use of the human intellect to clarify, to be mavarer on the Mishnah, and to draw it out into details. And it's dafka, the use of the human mind, that is doing this. So essentially, in the process of clarifying and drawing out more corollaries and rules and etc., it's engaging the human mind and essentially forcing gray matter into Elikus, if you will. And it almost feels like it's a kind of a merger of those two psukim we talked about. But again, in the first one, it's the human soul, it's the divine soul that's doing the transformation. Whereas here, it's really Torah that's harnessing the human intellect. Do you see the shaila, the question there? It's kind of
Well, because the question is based on because the Rebbe Rashab himself did not get back to Ner Mitzvah Torah Or till another 50, 60 pages. So we'll get
Right.
to that when we get there. It's premature to talk about it here because the Rebbe Rashab himself has not gone back there. He will go back there on page, let's see here, on page, let's see, quite a while, bottom line. Let's see here. Page 14, even further, wow. Yeah, long time from here. Page
but he doesn't really
1463.
apply it, does he?
On page 1463, he's going to go back to that, and that's when we'll discuss exactly this.
Uh-huh.
So it's completely not
Premature? Yeah.
well, it's bigger than it's more than that. The Maimorim of the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe were not just about Ner Mitzvah V'Torah. The Mittler Rebbe's Maimor was 75 pages. And the Rebbe Rashab takes the whole theme to a whole other level, talking about Er Hariyah. Now, I have given the flow and context quite a few times, probably maybe 20 times. So if you want to see how it flows from those Maimorim, I would just go back to the classes where I did the overview of how those Maimorim feed into this and how that will flow. So right now we're talking about Torah. If you really go to those Maimorim, you're going to find that before Ner Mitzvah V'Torah, he speaks about Tefillah, Shema, about how the animal soul is harnessed by the divine soul through Tefillah. Doesn't get to Torah or mitzvahs yet. Then comes mitzvahs and Torah. So the truth is, before we get to that, first we need to understand what he's going to say here about Torah and then he's going to go back to Ner Mitzvah and Torah and the Neshama. So it's my mind is very clear, the structure. I've tried to share it a number of times, the whole flow. Can't do it in every class, and I won't do it in every class. It'll be ridiculous to do that. But I definitely refer you to the places where I do that overview. And I've done it quite a few times. So it may take quite many reviews to get to that point, but it will all come together.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's stop here. We'll stop here at the bottom of stopping at, well, it's still the middle of the paragraph, but it's on page 1380, middle of 1380.